To go. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to introduce myself properly in a minute. I'm Simon Collinson. Just a few housekeeping rules. Hopefully you can see the slides in front of you. First of all, we're going to record this webinar just so that we can capture the interests and the priorities of the audience when we write up the event. Secondly, to all the audience, just do use the chat function to comment and to respond to other participants or audience, but specifically, can you use the Q&A function? There's a question and answer function in Zoom. Please use that to ask a question. That might be generally or to a particular participant. So if you can do that, that's absolutely fantastic. So let me introduce myself properly. I am Simon Collinson. I'm Deputy Pro-Vice Chancellor leading on regional engagement at the University of Birmingham, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this webinar. This is a webinar on civic universities and inclusive local economic recovery. And we're just sorting out some slides at the moment. There's my welcome slide. Thanks very much. Super. And it's fantastic. This is co-hosted by the Civic University Network and City Ready at the University of Birmingham. And we're really pleased to have over 240 people register, so I can see people arriving as I speak. University of Birmingham is one of the founding partners of the Civic University Network, and this network has really strong government support, and it was established with a hub at Sheffield Hallam University to help universities to develop and enhance, embed their civic role. And in particular, we've been focusing across this network on contribution to local communities and to making a positive societal change in local regions. This is also a central goal of City Ready, the City Region Economic Development Institute that I'm director of. We conduct research on the factors underlying economic growth in city regions. And we've also increasingly focused on policies to support inclusive growth and the trade-offs that policymakers have between inclusivity and productivity. And more recently, we've got very generous funding from UKRI's Research England. So we've established a series of projects that are focusing on evaluating and enhancing the contributions of universities within their local regions. So like many research institutes and universities more generally, we've now switched our focus at City Ready towards helping the city region cope with the COVID pandemic. Now for City Ready, this means providing weekly data analysis to help the mayor, the combined authority, other stakeholders, respond effectively and quickly to mitigate the economic effects of lockdown and some of the damaging social effects of the lockdown. Now, through our work and comparing the experiences of the other partners in the Civic University Network, it's become really apparent to us that some of the most effective and the most coordinated and confident responses to shocks like this are really based on having already established strong partnerships with host regions between universities and local stakeholders. So the pandemic has revealed in some ways where previous civic collaborations have created local partnerships with clear complementarities and a level of trust. And this becomes a platform to respond collectively and quickly. And this is one of the foundations of economic, societal, community resilience, and we're finding examples of strong partnerships that are helping provide support in the current time. We're also finding gaps in the relationship and the collaborations between universities and their regional stakeholders that we need to work on. And this is absolutely one of the core themes for our event today. The idea for the network for us is to better understand and then share across different regions insights into what makes for a strong civic university, and you can't do that in isolation. You have to do that in connection with the key stakeholders in that region. So we've produced a briefing paper that's gone out to all of the people who registered, and I said there's 240 registrations. It's super to see so much interest in this topic. We're also going to produce a report and distribute that report and the slides after this event. So before we kick off, let me just run through the agenda and go to the next slide. In a minute, I'm going to hand over to Lord Kerslake, Lord Robert Kerslake, who led the Civic University Commission. He's going to be joined by Lord David Willets and Sarah Davidson from the Carnegie UK Foundation for a discussion on the national context. and the general role of universities. Tremendous experience from those three speakers. They're going to be in conversation, but do send in questions. If you weren't here at the start, send in those questions on the Q&A, not the chat line, but the Q&A line. We've then got 3 presentations from 3 very different regions. And what we want to do is look at how these regions, we have a representative from the university and one from a local stakeholder, how they've created those collaborative partnerships. And we can compare across those different regions and understand the experience more generally across the UK. And that's going to be chaired by my colleague, Professor John Goddard. Then finally, we want to come back for a final session and give you even more of an opportunity as an audience to participate in the Q&A and to throw in your comments on the chat line. So we're really interested in hearing your views on this. So that's the agenda today. Fantastic that you can be with us. And I'm going to hand over with that to Lord Robert Kerslake, who's going to take us through the first session, focusing on the national context at this stage. Thanks very much. So if Lord Kerslake, you can unmute and your colleagues.
Thank you, pardon.
You have the floor.
Thank you, colleagues, and then we'll go. Can I first of all say well done to City Ready, to the University of Birmingham, and indeed to the Civic University Network for setting up this event, which I think is very timely and very relevant. Now, what we're going to cover in this first very short session of half an hour is the issue of what the national context is to the discussions. And what I'd say is that the importance of the civic role and indeed the importance of inclusive growth were very clear before COVID. So, for example, the response to the Civic University Commission was very substantial, cross-party and significant engagement from universities, which in turn led to the network, where we've had great involvement and a great commitment, by the way, to producing civic university agreements. So that was a big agenda, and its importance was growing. Similarly, of course, the whole agenda about inclusive growth, the left behind places, and indeed levelling up was a significant part of the debate during the general election and has continued to be important. My personal view is that COVID has accelerated the importance of these two agendas and increased the need for them to be very effective in the years ahead in what we now see as the recovery that we're going to have to do post-COVID. During the COVID period, I think it's fair to say, and we heard a bit about this a minute ago, that there's been both a strengthening of those partnerships between the different civic agencies. I've certainly seen it in Sheffield, and a lot of collaboration and cooperation. And in the end, the response to COVID is directed in policy terms from national government, but it's delivered locally. And to deliver locally has required very powerful collaboration between the parties. Not perfect, but a lot of great work done, and reinforce and strengthen those partnerships. So the question I think a lot of people are thinking about is how do we, in a sense, capture and build on that success moving forward into the recovery period, which now may be a bit longer in its duration. And I think one of the key points to pick out from this is the efforts that have gone into the slogan, if you like, Build Back Better, delivery of plans into the comprehensive spending review. Many places across the country have done them. Big collaboration required to achieve that across universities, local government and others. We don't yet know how that process will play out. To some extent, it's more in hope than expectation. But it does point to the agenda of partnership and effective plans to recover with or without, if you like, additional government assistance here. And we know that there's already a long track record in the, let's call it the advanced economy. It's how we also make this work in the everyday or the foundational economy as well, and how those partnerships can not just be good feelings, but actually effective in delivering change. So a lot to cover in this very short period. And with that introduction, I'd now like to move over to David Willits, who of course is both president of the Resolution Foundation and on the board of UCRI, and a previous Minister for Science and Universities. You may not be too unhappy not to be having that job at the moment, David. But with that, can I ask you just to say 3 or 4 minutes of introduction?
Yeah, thank you very much, Bob, and thanks for inviting me along today. And this whole civic university agenda, which you, Bob, have been pursuing so energetically, I think is absolutely on the money. It's proved very prescient setting up that commission and now the network. It's and if you look, for example, at Gavin Williamson's speech to UUK this year, he went out of his way to talk about the important local economic role of universities. And as you rightly said as well, COVID has just intensified our understanding of how much universities contribute, not just the local economy, but also the local health ecosystem. In terms of our seminar, just 2 or 3 quick points. First of all, it's always good to have examples of good practice. The original report had that. The more we can show in practice what the contribution that universities make, the better. That's very relevant. Secondly, as we're talking about the national environment, I'm very aware as a member of the board of UKRI how the research incentive structure can promote some forms of behavior and penalize others. And my personal view, not speaking now wearing my UKRI hat, my personal view is that there are risks in, for example, saying every research active academic has to be submitted to the REP, which often ends up being advances prestigious journals. We need other ways of measuring the contribution that universities make, including on research. And then the other point that I would make is the 2 university model, of which Sheffield is a conspicuous example, Nottingham is another example, very interesting when 2 different universities collaborate. There's always this tension in the higher education sector. To what extent are universities competing? To what extent are they collaborating? There's a combination of the 2. Birmingham, our hosts, let's face it, is a more complex environment with more than 2 universities. If you can include FE as well in a way that does not threaten the distinctive identity of FE colleges, that also I think is an extra strength. So showing how different universities and FE colleges can work together in the pursuit of a civic agenda for an area, I think is absolutely where the national policy debate is. And I hope we make some progress on that this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. A very helpful introduction to our discussion. I'd now like to move over to Sarah, Chief Executive of the Carnegie Trust Foundation, and indeed a supporter of the Civic University Network. So, Sarah.
Thank you very much, and good morning. It's really good to be part of the discussion this morning. So for the Carnegie UK Trust, the appeal of the Civic University model has always been twofold. It's that commitment to the well-being and success of particular places, but also to knowledge and research really made useful to practitioners. And I think we've already agreed this morning that the pandemic has surely highlighted the critical importance of both of those aims. In the final report of the Civic University Commission, you said yourself, Lord Kerslake, that universities need all the friends they can get. And I think that feels truer than ever today, but it's also the case that communities, the length and breadth of the UK, are also in urgent need of friends to work together on plans for recovery and renewal. I think the provocation I would maybe offer at the start of this session relates to the framing of this conversation, which could potentially be read as positing economic and social issues as being separate entities. And if there's anything that we've learned or been reminded of in the past few months, it's that our health, our well-being and our economy are intimately bound up with each other. And it's really impossible to separate one from the other when looking at both the direct and indirect effects of the virus. But when you start with an intention to be relevant to a place, then the holistic and interlinked nature of economic and social policy aims, I think, becomes clear very quickly. So the question should be less, how can we connect economic growth and social inclusion? And more, what can we do to help here now? And as the Commission observed, the starting point is the needs of the place, considered and understood in the widest sense possible. And that's why, as I think you've already indicated, looking at a national level only takes you so far, and very quickly you need to get to individual places. Interestingly, the Carnegie UK Trust is publishing research today which indicates that the most effective local response and support services provided in the first phase of the pandemic were those which were collaborations between different agencies and organisations, focusing on meeting identified needs. And it's very clear that in the case studies that we set out there, faced with the urgency and scale of the challenge, partners suddenly found that they could overcome some quite long-standing differences about roles and responsibilities and just make things happen, often, interestingly, working with less known grassroots organisations. And where there were already strong existing relationships in place, those collaborations were notably quicker to get off the ground and much more effective in operation. So although that's a slightly different set of partners, I think the same principle should absolutely apply to the civic partnerships that universities are engaging in just now. As a trust, which has had an interest in place for a long time, we have learned over many years of working in localities that if you want to understand both what is going on and what is needed and important, you need to engage with a wide range of actors, including some unusual suspects. And you can't separate communities in the voluntary sector from those who represent business and the local community. They are all connected in that local ecosystem, even if, let's be honest, the statutory authorities themselves are sometimes guilty of trying to silo them. And that's where I think the Civic University could in fact be one of the key players capable of seeing the whole picture through the breadth of its work and engagements. And that convening power is considerable and a potentially significant strategic asset to be able to offer to statutory agencies which are stretched to the limit at the moment with operational challenges. So more than ever right now, places need input from those with the capacity to think forward. And we can't afford to allow innovative academic thinking about technology, transport, energy, health, work, whatever, to get stuck in the university, but nor can we afford to allow this research to be conducted in a bubble, separate from the multiple useful perspectives that could be brought to bear in the quadruple helix framework. Places really need their anchor institutions at the moment, the big employers with influence and relative stability, to lean into the challenges that are posed by the health and the jobs crisis. But they also need knowledge institutions who can help solve old and new problems in innovative ways, understanding how ideas translate into practice in real lives and in real places. So for my money, the questions that are posed in the accompanying note to today's webinar are absolutely key. And when you read those alongside the Civic University Network pledges, they're a clear call to action, and I believe to finding and demonstrating relevance at this really critical point in time.
Thank you very much for that, Sarah. Very a clear analysis of the challenge, if you like, to us going forward. I just wanted to pick up as a kind of first question to both David and yourself, Sarah. To what extent do we need to define what we mean by inclusive local and economic recovery? Or as you suggested, Sarah, is it more about identifying what needs to be done now, place by place? Are we getting perhaps too caught up in putting boundaries around what is and isn't part of economic recovery? David.
Yeah, I would say that one needn't get too tied up in the analysis. Indeed, if universities and labs come up with local examples of what needs to be done, and
I think, David, you're frozen. This does happen. Occupational hazard, isn't it? My suggestion is perhaps I move to
challenging that itself as a benchmark of performance. Significant local.
I think Sarah, did you want to come in perhaps, and then
Yes,
Dave?
why don't I pick up?
So I, by the way, I don't know if I'm getting some messages, my internet can have some bandwidth.
It is, I'm afraid. David, can we come back to you and let Sarah say something? Hopefully the internet will stabilise again in a minute. Sarah.
Yes, and by the sounds of what David was saying at the beginning there, I think I'm probably going to make a very similar point, that I think if we start from the point of local relevance and local engagement and the importance of being locally reactive and reflective, then I do think spending too much time agonizing over what is and is not within the inclusive growth box is probably nugatory time. I think that all local partners will be responding and analysing what is required at the moment. And I think indeed, as we're seeing the way that the pandemic is itself playing out differently in different places and shining quite different lights on the questions of how local accountability is manifest in different places, then the nature of the response is I think, by definition, going to be different. So I certainly think there's an urgency at the moment, and we ought to see the urgency as being a real opportunity to effectively talk less and do more, and to worry less about theory and really get our sleeves rolled up and engaged in practice. And it'll be interesting to hear from our case studies later to what extent the theory and the framework has mattered to them as they've been getting on and doing practical things. It's one of the things I'm interested to explore there.
Yeah, thank you for that. David, I don't know if your signal has stabilised a bit now.
Yeah, I did hear what Sarah said and very much agree with it. And all I would say is add to that some local ambitions, some local targets that are challenging, and then civic universities will help shape the agenda. If they, with a LEP, say, this is what we're going to try to do for our local economy over the next 2 or 3 years, these are the things that really matter in this area, judge us against this performance, I think that would go down very well.
Just, David, just building on this a little further, when I was doing the commission, one of the key tensions, if you like, was, or perceived tensions, I'm interested to hear your views on it, was between what might be called a kind of UCRI view that resources on research ought to be focused on a very competitive process linked to high-end research on the global challenges, and really anything that looks like it deflects from that focuses more on local impact is the wrong direction to be going in. I paraphrase it. It wasn't quite as crude as that, but I wonder if the new world we're in now requires some adjustment to the thinking on that.
Yes, and the answer is that the old incentive structure was rather monocultural. And I think what you describe, aiming for absolutely world-leading research, will be a very important criterion. But UKRI increasingly has a place agenda as well, and that budget is growing, and there will be, so I think it's very likely, we don't know how the CSR will play out, but we will have budgets, including on the research side, where the criteria are rather different and more diverse, including local criteria. But that is not finally decided yet. It'll partly depend on the public spending allocation.
Watch the space then, I think, is a key message there. But just moving back to Sarah, clearly the Carnegie Trust is co-funding the Civic University Network, which is great, I think. There's clearly, for you, an experience previously as being the DG and the Scottish Government as well. I'm wondering whether, kind of in that spirit of challenge, where do you think universities can and should be doing more to connect with communities and foster this kind of more community-based approach to their engagement? Yes,
so maybe reflect on that both from the Carnegie perspective and also, as you say, from the Scottish Government. We at Carnegie, we've had a long interest in the interaction agenda, and in particular in encouraging the co-production of evidence between universities working with the third public and private sectors. And where we have seen that done well, we have seen really interesting examples of all parties understanding their places better. We did an interesting bit of work last year with Newcastle University, Newcastle City Council and the FSB and a number of third sector bodies to produce a guide to the co-creation of research. And that identified 4 principles, which I think hold good for all work, not simply co-creation of research, but for all work that universities do locally with other partners. Recognizing that some challenges are just too big and complex for one organization to tackle alone, and you need those multiple perspectives, and everybody needs to recognize that. But that time is needed to build trust, and that you have to take an approach where you value everybody's time and knowledge. And that once trust is established, you have to have a clear and united sense of purpose understood and shared by all the partners, and recognize that each partner needs to benefit, but that benefit might take different forms. And I think we would say that that ought to guide the way in which universities are engaging with local communities, and that a spirit of humility and curiosity needs to mark that engagement. And I was reflecting a bit this morning on looking back to my perspective from the Scottish Government, because of course in Scotland for quite some years now, we have had a common national performance framework with a shared set of outcomes, which all the statutory sector, but also all those with public funding are committed to pursuing. And that has both been pursued nationally, but also taken the form of a very strong focus on community planning right across Scotland. But in my experience, the college sector tended to be a much more enthusiastic and visible participant in that community planning than the university sector. And as a result, the college sector found it easier to connect with the third sector membership of that community planning structure. And it's interesting, the Scottish Funding Council at the moment is undertaking a review of sustainability and provision in Scotland at the request of the Scottish Government, and it's encouraging to see that engagement in place is part of the spec for that. Because I think one part of the learning from Scotland is that simply having a framework in place and exhorting people to follow that, going back to what we were saying about incentives a moment ago, is not necessarily enough to actually at a local level drive that engagement between universities and local communities. And certainly it would be great to see, we'll hear about from Glasgow later, but it'd be great to see some other universities in Scotland becoming more actively engaged in the civic university movement.
No, that's really helpful. Very interesting question from Erica about universities have typically in the past done research on communities rather than research for communities. What's your view on that, Sarah?
I would absolutely agree. And interesting, one of the things that we have been funding over the last couple of years at Carnegie is a project called Engaging Libraries, which marries up public library services with knowledge partners in universities, with the very explicit purpose of engaging communities in both actually sometimes defining the scope of research, but then engages them in being participants in that research to the benefit of everyone. And it's been interesting for me as somebody who's relatively new to this area of investigation to recognize the extent to which that is quite new territory for a lot of both the people working in communities, but also people working in universities. And one that has huge potential, and about which the researchers who become involved are hugely enthusiastic and very keen to see this as the start of longer term collaborations rather than just a one-off event.
Thank you. That's very encouraging. Your phrase about a sense of utility, a sense of humility, I should say, is very powerful. David, we've focused here on universities who are currently in the eye of the storm because of COVID at the moment. I know in Hallam we're anxiously watching what's happening in terms of the number of cases, etc. I wonder what you think government needs to be doing to, if you like, encourage universities to continue to work on the civic role and indeed on inclusive growth.
Well, as I said, I think that there are economic incentives at work here, and I that in the new public spending settlement are to be rewarded. And the question, we just of that. And I would say, as well as that, the more that universities can work with the health service and local councils on COVID measures for their students, the better. Near where I am, the University of Portsmouth has got a partnership with those in doing walk-in testing for students and local citizens. Anything that shows that type of local engagement, universities creating their own testing capacity, which is the pressure point at the moment, will be really useful.
Right, that's very helpful. Look, a very interesting question has come in that we've perhaps chastising us a bit for being over-focused on research and not saying enough about the role of universities in the skills agenda. We had a big announcement from the Prime Minister yesterday, and indeed on adult education, which was a big theme of our Commission report. So interested just to hear from both of you, if you like. What does that? What should that education piece look like going into recovery? Sarah?
So I agree with the importance of looking at that angle of it as well. I'm hesitating slightly because I think I probably don't feel fully qualified to take a view, other than to say that there is absolutely no doubt that the needs of a place for providing the skills that are required in order to support its economy are going to be have to be understood, both for the higher education, but also working closely, as we heard earlier, with the further education sector, and therefore understanding what the skills are that are going to be needed, and assessing the ability of those to be provided locally in a way which is extremely flexible and responsive over the period ahead, I think is absolutely critical, and something which there would be a real risk in higher education institutions trying to work out on their own. So again, a very good argument for being absolutely joined at the hip with other local agencies.
I thought, Bob, that the report, the proposals yesterday from the Prime Minister were fantastic. I think he's taken the best bits of Augur, and I think a particular opportunity for universities is on level 4 and 5 qualifications, where there has been a very peculiar position where they weren't really eligible for student loan support, apart perhaps for HNCs and HNDs. Universities stepping forward and creating level 4, level 5 qualifications over a year or so would be a great response to the Prime Minister's initiative. And secondly, this issue of partnership with FE colleges, where I'll be frank, I mean, there have been mixed views within government, even mixed views historically within the Department for Education. Some people wanting to promote partnership, others thinking these big universities would swallow up FE colleges that would lose their distinctive identity. Evidence that universities can work with FE, including things like sharing resource, sharing kit for lab-based subjects, but with FE colleges retaining a high level of autonomy. I think that is absolutely where the agenda is after yesterday's announcement.
Completely agree with you on that. We indeed have the chief executive of our local college on our board, and I think that, and vice versa, I think we've got to move away from this hierarchy and move to a more collaborative, equal approach in this. Look, the time is coming near to an end. Can I see if there are any other questions, Simon, from the audience I might want to bring in?
There's one more good one about how universities might help increase the economic empowerment of lower income women and men in their cities, which is about the inclusive growth agenda. We could probably make that the last one if panelists have comments on that one.
I'd be interested. I'm going to slightly tweak it and say, give us an answer on that question, but also tell us, if you had a crystal ball, where are we going to be in a year's time on all this? So, you start, David, and then I'll give Sarah a chance to think about it.
Well, I'm actually increasingly an optimist for universities. Let's face it, it's been a years. Beginning with the issue of Vice Chancellor's pay, an increasing narrative then of sort of choices has been terrible for all of us and for the country. Actually, it's remarkable. I also think that the A-level grades people and their parents are to have, there's yesterday's announcement, which was full of positive stuff on skills. What Boris didn't do was turn it into a conflict between FE and HE, where FE was good and HE was bad. So I think that if universities do the kind of things that your commission and network is advocating and show they can work with local partners and do useful things locally, then the period of kind of least public political support for universities will be behind us, and we're on an upward trajectory. So I am an optimist.
So I think I take a similar view on the first question, the very specific one. It seems to me that that is exactly the kind of local challenge which, if identified, a university ought to be really well placed to support as part of a local inclusive growth agenda, recovery agenda. On the longer term, yes, as I was hinting earlier, I think one of the things that it's quite interesting to observe happening now as a result of the pandemic is this really interesting focus on the question of who knows their place, who speaks for their place, who takes decisions for their place. And I think we'll see over the next year that really that tension between central government control and the reasserting of places playing out more. And we see it at the moment in relation to the specificity of individual lockdown arrangements, but I think we'll increasingly see it start to play out in recovery as well. And I would like to believe that that will give a real impetus to local collaborations, local partnerships, who knows, possibly further devolution. And that in that, if those universities who want to find a place can find a place. And it may be interesting that the almost unprecedented in recent times focus that we've had on universities in the last few months and weeks, not entirely for happy reasons, will remind people of the fact that universities exist in places. They don't exist in a bubble. And I think it's all there to be grasped if people want to take it.
Thanks, Sarah. We're going to wrap up now. I just finished my bit with saying, Sarah referred to a publication coming out today. Tomorrow, UK 2070 publishes its report, Go Big, Go Local. So very much on the theme of local devolution and the importance of place. Great to finish on an optimistic note. And thank you very much to David and Sarah for the conversation. I think you now move into a break, Simon.
We do, and my sincere thanks to David and Sarah and yourself for contributing in that way. It was an excellent set of points. We're going to take a 5-minute break. Some of those panelists will be with us through the rest of the session, but please do take a break, come back in 5 minutes at the absolute most, and panelists will be here ready to go. Thanks very much.
Okay, let me just get to the screen. Well, welcome everybody. I'm trying to see myself at the moment, just a second. Well, I don't know if everyone can see me, but good morning, everyone. We now move on from the national to the local perspective to address the questions set out in the background note you have received. If you've not had a chance to read it, please do so after the event. And I'll just read that question out. How can civic universities mobilize their capabilities and resources in response to the COVID-19 pandemic by building on existing relationships and agreements with civic partners? The note says that we want to explore how best to build and enhance relationships, the incentives, structures and arrangements that lead to better collaborations, and how universities can both contribute to better outcomes and evidence what they do. To do this, we've asked 3 of the core partners supporting the Civic University Network from Birmingham, Newcastle and Glasgow University to join with their local partners and share their experience with us. I've asked each partnership to speak for 8 minutes, and we will then have approximately 10 minutes for Q&A after they have spoken. There then will be a short break before a final Q&A session, which Simon will host about the way ahead. I hope we will then connect with the two sessions and amongst other issues discuss. And here again, the quote, how local partnerships can help with connecting national policies in the field of higher education, research and innovation, public health, and last but not least, city and regional development from the bottom up. So I now hand over to the University of Birmingham and the West Midlands. Thank you.
Thanks, John. I'm Rebecca Riley. I'm the Business Development Director at West Midlands Regional Economic Development Institute, which is a sister institute to City Ready. Jonathan, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, good morning. I'm Jonathan Skinner. I'm the Head of Economy and Local Industrial Strategy at the West Midlands Combined Authority. And between Beck and I, we've got a few slides to paint the picture for what's happening in the West Midlands, but also to try and hone in on a few of the kind of dilemmas, working practices that we think will be useful to kind of spark further debate and questioning. So we have a few slides. I think I'm going to kind of kick off with the first few, and then Beck will come in. But I just really wanted to begin by setting out some of the cultural dynamics that I think are incredibly important for kind of shaping the space where universities work well with those local stakeholders. So I think, as is the topic for this webinar, that a strong local recovery depends on effective leadership and policies that both mitigate the downside and of any economic shock and accelerate those growth opportunities. Such leadership, and particularly most of England's major regional cities, rests upon some of the devolution structures and some of those more traditional kind of institutions that have been put in place. And so I thought it was just really useful to give a bit of an insight into some of those cultural relationships between particularly the kind of public institutions along with the universities and others. So I know many on the colleagues on the call will know, but it's all useful, I think, to just set out some of the dynamics behind those combined authorities in particular. So very much the clue is in the title, that they combine the power of the constituent authorities, additionally with a directly elected mayor, plus those kind of powers and resources that have been devolved from central government to be able to kind of drive inclusive growth through the really pinpointing that power on particularly some of those major systemic problems. The West Midlands Combined Authority and its board has 7 constituent authorities, 10 non-constituent authorities, business voices through the LEPs, and then others through the trade unions and Young Combined Authority. And I think that shows just the rich tapestry of voices, and therefore there is inherently this kind of challenge that we face in being able to harness the focus of such a kind of wide range of partners, in being able to focus on those points of different systems that we really want to make a difference on at any moment in time. So our aim is to harness that collective weight, and I think particularly the experience that we've had that universities, where with their kind of expertise, the evidence that they can provide, can really help in both pinpointing some of those kind of major policy problems and be able to then follow that through in the policy making process. As Beck was describing, for this inherently kind of political process, we're fortunate in the West Midlands to have some of that kind of technocratic, I guess, expertise, particularly through WM Ready, a university-based think tank funded by Research England. And that's really collaboration, as she said, between universities, the Combined Authority and the LEPs, and just reflecting very quickly some of its outputs kind of over the last 6 months have been incredibly helpful for us. So the State of the Region report provides a really authoritative piece of very wide-ranging kind of evidence about the state of the region. But then, you know, the kind of annual or 6 monthly kind of footprint of that, given the expertise, the experience of the shock, we've known that something more frequent has been needed. So the weekly monitors that Beck and Simon's team have produced have been absolutely excellent, along to has been their advice about the evaluation and how we understand the impacts of projects that have been developed to be able to address some of those challenges. So that's just a reflection of kind of where we start in some of the cultural dynamics and what has been happening in the West Midlands. If we move on to the next slide, which I think will look at some of the things that policymakers want from universities. I'll start in a slightly unorthodox fashion just with the kind of second bullet point, which is recognising really the power that universities have as institutions about being able to kind of attract talent. I think that's incredibly important with all of those dimensions that they play, but really for the purposes of this, and I know that we're kind of tight on time, I want to look at those other 3 bullet points, which I think are really important stages in kind of that classic policy debating process. But so often various of those sections can kind of be shortcut. And so I think that it's important that universities can not only play a role in being able to kind of influence with the information intelligence expertise that they have, but also be able to kind of give that constructive challenge, that rigor in how policymakers kind of manage that process and involve a kind of really diverse range of voices, both from academics, but also others from communities and wider afield, to make sure that kind of policy making process gives the most effective outputs it can. So that's my kind of quick reflection from both a cultural point and what policymakers are looking for. I think Beck's now going to take us through what universities want.
Yeah, so from a university point of view, I think what academics want fundamentally is for policymakers to be open to evidence and research that they might prepare. But we've got this issue, which I think was raised earlier on, about this tension between political activity versus the evidence and the rigor and the knowledge, and how we bring those together. And I think one of the issues around that is the speed in which things are done, and also the keeping up with that in terms of the evidence. What universities also want, in terms of picking up on Jonathan's second point, is to be seen as an important anchor institution, to be seen as somebody who can create place and can invest, which means that they require support for investment, support for attracting and winning investment, support in developing the right skills within the place that they are based, and also to develop themselves within that local infrastructure. Following on from that, really, I think there is a key thing around, and this applies both to a university's role as a place investor, as a skills developer, and an attractor of research funding and delivery of research, is about understanding the strategic aims of a place. What are the objectives that region, that city, that town that you're based in wants to achieve? What's your outcomes? How do you want to be shaped and created? And therefore, what's the university's role in fitting in with that? And how can the university contribute? Within that, that's about collaborative thinking. It's not about a policymaker deciding this is what's going to happen, but it's about a discussion and discourse that creates that. And also being able to understand the wider contribution of universities to place. They want policymakers to recognise that it's more than delivering a particular programme, that it's more than delivering a particular set of research, but it's about that holistic role of universities. And then also within that, I think if we move on to sort of the challenges slide, I think building on that, one of the things that is really key between universities and policymakers on that balance is understanding each other's sense of time and capacity to act. And I think we have a difficult position at the moment, potentially because of this first bullet point, where we have a central government that sends down different funding streams, different activities, different strategies to write, etc. And universities struggle to keep up with that. So how we enable that interaction to happen is quite important. and how we prevent this project-based strategy, i.e. let's collect a lot of good ideas and put them together, and really think long-term about the strategic role and goals of the place and how that strategy can be developed, and actually how policymakers use universities, as Jonathan said, as that independent rigor, as that challenge authority, because that's a role that we can play. Following on from that is this issue around leadership. The institutions, I think some of the Q&A have highlighted this for things like what happens when a place doesn't have an institution? What happens if they're in a rural area where you're far from an institution? So I think there is a real problem with this leadership role within place and how universities can help, not just the place they might be, but places beyond, because they have the skills and capacity to do that. And there is also the levers and the powers that places have to actually act on research, because there is a danger that we create research for policymakers, and the policymakers agree with it, but actually they don't have the levers. A good example at the moment would be around the impact of COVID. We've got a lot of local levers, and as Jonathan said, we've done a lot around the monitoring reports that we produce that said these are the issues you're facing. But actually, does that place have the right levers? And what role can universities do in helping that place make a case for creating levers? A good example there is sort of the employment issue that we're facing. Actually, a lot of the employment levers are not held at the local level, but it's probably the biggest issue that we're going to be facing in the next 10 years. Democratisation, and this was mentioned earlier by some of the speakers, how do we include citizens in that? And we've done quite a few pieces of work around doing that, including one with with Birmingham City Council at the moment, looking at developing their city vision. But there are fundamentally conflicting purposes, so that speed versus blue skies, the long term versus the short term. In that, places need the monitoring and the constant updating of that, but they also need us to think big. We need to understand the mega trends and the things that are impacting us. Collaboration and contracting, public procurement is a real barrier to this. And there has to be ways around that we can, and we've come up with really innovative ways of doing collaboration agreements between ourselves and the universities. And lastly, in terms of this, and it picks up on the earlier comments from the panelists, is this academic versus policy issues and uses, and the way that academics are performance managed and the things that they have to respond to versus what a place might need. So I think there are an awful lot of challenges and opportunities there that in the West Midlands, we've actually done an awful lot in terms of trying to tackle those to create this collaborative structure that, in 5-10 years time should be great.
Okay, thanks very much. We're pushed for time, so we move on now to the Newcastle and the North East. So Jane and Henry, you have the floor.
Thanks very much. Good morning, everyone. My name's Jane Robinson from Newcastle University. I'm very pleased to be able to talk a little bit about the experience in the North East. I was very struck by Sarah's comments at the opening session about the need for capacity to innovate and think forward. And I think that is combined at the moment with a real drive around collaboration. And certainly in the North East, we've seen a real collaborative approach between all the universities across the wider region with our partners in LETS, further education, voluntary and community sector, and critically working with our combined authorities to develop and co-create plans for inclusive growth. So I am really pleased that Henry Kippin from the North Tyne Combined Authority is able to join me today to talk a little bit about the approach that we're taking there. Over to you, Henry.
Hi, thanks, Jane, and hi, everybody. And it's nice to, I must say, it's nice to see some former West Midlands colleagues on the call as well. Hello, everybody. And I must emphasise that I have moved in the right direction from the West Midlands up to the wonderful North East. Just wanted to get that one out there early. If you skip to the next slide, please, that would be really handy. So what I'm going to do here is not go through each of these 5 lovely areas, but this represents what the North of Tyne in particular, as part of a wider regional collaboration, is putting on the table to support our COVID recovery plans. There's lots to agree with in the comments that that have been made so far about how you create the right relationships to deliver on any of these things, which are intrinsically cross-sector, but I just wanted to pick out 3 things. First is, I think, the practical reality of building a collaboration between a group of universities and a combined authority. That takes work and effort and relationship building, and I think we've made a really good start here in the north of Tyne. I think the quicker you can get beyond the cash transfer version of the conversation, the better, the more likely we are to be able to create some of that kind of cross-sector commissioning and delivery that we've talked about. And I certainly think we've made a good start in the north of Tyne and across the northeast more widely. Second thing I'd pick out, and this has been mentioned, was mentioned by Sarah and others, is, you know, if we're not going back to normal or normal's gone on any of these 5 areas that I've got on the screen here, then we're going to need quite large scale innovation in order to think and work on what comes next. And that in turn requires different ways of working. And I think that traditional kind of public policy, here's how you deliver a service to get an outcome or to get a result, is somewhat dead in the water when we're thinking about some of the challenges we're facing reawakening our places after COVID. And then lastly, I would say, and this relates to all of these areas, there is a big difference in my view, and I'm sure Jane will share this view, between administering great public services and leading and working in a place and taking it somewhere. And the point that was made about who's writing the story, who's telling the story about where we go next, I think is a fundamental part of the role of a civic university to be involved in and help to shape that work. Next slide, please. So we're going to get, I promise, more practical as this presentation goes through. We've only got 2 more slides, but what I wanted to pick out is 4 or 5 areas where we think that within the north of Tyne, there are really kind of good, interesting examples of the kind of collaboration that substantiates the civic university proposition. So we're pushing for a different order of, actually, hang on, there's one slide before that. Do we want to go to the slide just before that? Or maybe just after that? It might be coming up slowly on my screen. That's the last one, the different ways of working, new ways of working slide, please. That's it. That's it. So I want to pick out 4 or 5 things here, which I think are really quite relevant and quite current. Different model of collaboration. We've talked about that. We are working with our universities on our recovery coordination group as a region for the wider northeast, and that I think is notable. We're trying to produce a different evidence base for how we support long-term recovery from COVID, which is an intrinsically cross-sector enterprise: health, economy, transport, public safety, communities, all involved, and the universities actively involved in helping us to deliver that. We talked about new ways of working, and I think actually what a university can bring to a combined authority here is a set of tools that come from different disciplines. This is not a new argument, but it's absolutely now more necessary than ever. For me, in public policy, this is less about, you know, reading and taking insights from a politics department on traditionally how you deliver in government, and more about the mix of urban geography and public health and complexity science coming out of business schools. They're all areas where you need much more, I think, and more intensive collaboration. I would also pick out, I think, the point about translation and impact and relevance, and that is a kind of softly between the lines way of talking about the point that David Willits raised, I think, about what it takes in order to invest in doing this properly at the scale that we need. You know, excellence is one part of a complex picture in terms of how you might translate R&D into value for communities, into value for the economy. We absolutely are co-investing, I think, in the north of Tyne and Newcastle in particular, on how you amplify that translational impact. And Jane's going to talk about 1 or 2 areas where that is most relevant. And I think we will continually, as a combined authority, make the case for devolution of research funding at a scale that we haven't seen for precisely that reason. And then I think, lastly here, we understand absolutely that if we're pushing for a different type of economy that works in different ways and that improves overall our social and economic productivity, that needs to be an R&D heavy economy. And so in areas where within the northeast we have those assets and we think we have the potential to go that journey around areas like the aging economy, clean energy, for example, growth of a different kind of digital economy, they're all areas where a strong collaboration with our anchor universities is absolutely vital. So in sum, for my bit, I think what we'll come to is really practical, tangible examples of what needs to be a closer and closer collaboration beyond the transaction, to thinking about how you apply a civic university and actually a connected combined authority as two concepts that need to work together in practice. Back to you, Jane.
Thanks very much, Henry. And if we go back to that previous slide, just to give it sort of some concrete examples, I am mindful of time, so I won't go through these in detail, but I think what we're trying to do now is make sure that, to some of the earlier points, that we are responding to both the challenges but also the opportunities that we see in the Northeast and in North of Tyne particularly, and thinking about how we innovate for the future in a joined up way. So we're moving beyond those transactional relationships that Henry described to a much more joined up and strategic approach to how we can work collaboratively, whether that be about understanding our place through data and insight, and developing a more evidence-based policy making approach, or thinking about some of the opportunities that we have around new markets, around climate, and an aging population, and seeing that as potentially the assets that we have within our universities and with our partners in health and in local government, as well as business, bringing that all together. And I think to the point around actually anchor institutions and what that means for more rural and coastal locations, I think it's very clear that the collaboration in the Northeast gives us that opportunity to have anchor institutions that actually reach out and spread the benefits across a wider region. So I'll pause there and hand on to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Jane. And now we move to Scotland. And there's been in the chat, there has been some discussion about the devolved nations from Wales. So it's now good to think that this is a UK-wide agenda, and hand over to our colleagues from Glasgow. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Des McNulty here, Assistant Vice Principal at Glasgow University. I'll introduce Kevin in a minute. Just wanted to flag up that, you know, like in other places, COVID has accelerated the importance of civic universities here in Scotland. And I think it has strengthened partnerships between universities and other civic partners. And we'll try to talk a wee bit about how that's happened in Scotland. But there is a different architecture in Scotland. And maybe it'd be good for Kevin, as Director of Regional Economic Growth, to say a few things about what the distinctive features are of the landscape in Scotland, and how partnerships have been built on in the context of COVID. So Kevin, can I hand over to you?
Thank you, Des. So as you'll see from my title, I'm Kevin Rush. I'm the Director of Regional Economic Growth for the Glasgow City region, which makes me the DREG. They assured me when I got the job that wasn't a comment on my abilities. Conscious obviously of everyone's time, and Des has got a number of points to cover in the final slide. So just a few points I think I'd like to make, echoing a lot I think of what's already been said so far. But I guess the way in which we've partnered with the universities within the city region, we tend to think in kind of three main areas. First of all, the universities, and actually the college sector as well, as key providers of talent for any city region. We're very proud in Glasgow of being behind only Bristol in terms of our population with degree level qualifications. We have about 44%, and that's a huge part, as someone mentioned earlier on, when it comes to inward investment, etc., to be able to assure people that when they invest in a city or a city region, that the talent pool is there. I think the second point, again echoing, it's terrible going last because everyone said the things you're going to say, but what people have said earlier on, the universities as anchor institutions, actually higher and further education is a key sector in its own right. I'm an economic development person, so I would look at the economic benefits from that. But I think in terms of the number of people who are employed, the procurement power of the universities, the spend that comes from the universities, the knock-on impact of footfall dependent businesses who are around our universities cannot be underestimated. I think that's a second important point to make. And then the third one, I guess, which is what we're focusing on today, is the university as a provider of thought leadership. So I guess, again, in a kind of Glasgow context, which I'll show you in the next slide, we've leaned very, very heavily, I think, in the universities to lead in things like the Glasgow Economic Leadership Board, the Commission for Economic Growth, which Des is Vice Chair of, work in terms of defining inclusive growth, etc. The universities are absolutely central to us in that, and Des will touch on some specifics later on. But he did mention the institutional landscape in Scotland. If you guys think you've got it hard, we've got two governments to deal with. So there are particular challenges that come, as you can see there in the national picture, two national governments, 41 executive non-departmental bodies, including the National Skills and National Enterprise Agencies, Skills Development Scotland and Scottish Enterprise, 10 executive agencies and 14 health boards. As you would expect in a cluttered landscape, none of these things are coterminous. So there are real challenges that we have. We have increasingly started to think of ourselves as a city region in recent times, but even that doesn't cut across things like the Health Board, Scottish Enterprise or SDS. So challenges that come with that. Nonetheless, I think it's probably important to note in a regional context that Glasgow is a functioning regional economy. 92% of jobs within the city region are from residents who live within there. So there is a real sense that people travel across the city region. And the size of Glasgow in a Scottish context is huge. You know, 40% of the Scottish economy is in Glasgow when you bring the 8 local authorities together. So what we do really matters. And what has changed in recent times, obviously, was the signing of the City Deal for Glasgow in 2014, which really made us think about new ways of working, which made us think about working more in partnership and less in silos. Can we have the next slide? Thanks. So what that's led to is us trying to cut through that very complicated structure and start to look at how we organise ourselves. I think in terms of policy development, there's no Scottish equivalent of the Resolution Foundation, Policy Exchange or IFS. And the universities themselves, I think, have helped to fill those policy gaps. So as you can see in terms of organisational delivery there, we have things like the Glasgow Economic Leadership Board, etc. All of these chaired by the principals of the universities. And I think just important really to note before I pass on to Des to talk to the final slide, because I'm conscious of time, the universities are actually leading these for us. So Anton Muscatelli, who's the principal at Glasgow University, is the chair of the commission. Jim McDonald, who's the chair of Strathclyde University, is the chair of the Glasgow Economic Leadership Board. We look to the universities to provide that leadership for us. So happy to pass on to Des just to take us through the rest. You're on mute, Des.
Can you hear me now? Yeah. So one of the things that's actually quite difficult is kind of gathering together for everybody what the nature of civic engagement is and trying to find a formula that can explain it both internally within the university and also externally without it. And we've come up with the idea of the 3 C's: connect, collaborate, and communicate the different arguments that we're trying to put forward. I want to just highlight some of the things that we've done. In health, there's been the mobilization of clinical and life sciences staff, students and equipment in collaboration with NHS, Greater Glasgow and Clyde, and the 2 governments to create one of the 3 UK lighthouse testing centres. So picking up the challenge that David Willett said earlier on, Glasgow was really at the forefront of doing that, and also developing new diagnostics and treatments rooted in precision medicine. That health dimension, I think, is something that tends to be ignored in the civic university conversation, but it's a very important one. Secondly, in terms of tackling disadvantage, we've mobilised here to set up an academic advisory group that is translating research and curating expertise on the different aspects of COVID on protected groups and disadvantaged communities, supporting the Social Recovery Task Force, which the City Council has set up, on which the Health Board and other agencies, including the voluntary sector, are involved to build resilience and co-create new ways of working. So again, a very practical way forward. In terms of the green recovery, Glasgow is going to be the host of COP26 in November 2021. So we've been trying to take forward a series of dialogues and practical steps on the basis of building from COVID-19 to COVID-26. How do we coordinate green space, zero carbon and sustainability initiatives and involve the academic community of not just Glasgow University, but the other universities in the city, and bringing in expertise from elsewhere to kind of inform and help the COVID debate. And then fourth point, just to pick up, is the importance of digital and data analytics. So we at Glasgow have got the Open Big Data Centre, and they've been closely involved now in developing more effective use of data to support recovery and evidence-based implementation evaluation, which is linked to supporting the city's efforts to build its digital capacity, and also links in with joint working on connectivity. Those are four aspects or four dimensions that we're trying to take forward. I could have listed a dozen actually. So there's a whole series of things that have been taken forward or advanced as a result or in the context of COVID. But it's important to say that they are all based on existing partnerships. So we've been able to build on existing connections and existing relationships and take those to the new stage. The challenges and opportunities that are there are partly about internal issues as well as external issues. So how can we collaborate with other universities better than we do? I mean, David Willetts made the point about Sheffield and Nottingham as areas that universities that have worked together. We're beginning to do that with the University of Strathclyde and with the other universities in West Central Scotland, but that hadn't been something that had been developed as far as it could be. So how do we develop a cultural collaboration between the institutions that will continue beyond the current pandemic crisis? I think there's an issue about what cultural and organizational changes are needed within universities to make them more responsive to civic partners. Picks up some of the points that Beck in particular raised. So how do we move from a piecemeal supply-driven knowledge transfer model to a strategic partnership model and work out the different dimensions of that? Anchor institutions is a really important dimension. We are major agents within the local and regional economy, as well as being centres of learning. So how can we do that effectively within the city region, but how can research intensive institutions like the big city universities that we all are here work across geographies with institutions with different areas and different competences to better support left behind places? So it's not just within the city, it's actually how do we have an expanded regional dimension to this. And the final point I wanted to pick up is the importance of universities as, if you like, conduits for knowledge from elsewhere and links with other places in the UK and internationally. Some of the most successful things we've been able to do in Glasgow is to build networks on housing and on education that have informed responses in Scotland, but also informed responses in other places like Canada, Australia, Chile, etc. So we're using academic networks to focus on particular policy issues and bringing in policymakers from around the world who are dealing with common problems as a result of COVID, but hadn't previously been brought into conversation. So I think universities can play a key role in developing networks and extending them into policy communities, both nationally and internationally, as well as focusing on their regional role. Thank you.
Thank you, Des. We're really running out of time now. It's been quite difficult to keep it on time. You can't jump up and wave at the speakers and as if you're at a conference. So can I suggest that we move ahead to a final wrap up? And there's a lot of good questions that come through, which Simon's going to host. And I would really like to flag up the point into this discussion to try and connect the case studies with the national overview. How can local practice help with connecting national policy in the field of higher, further education, research and innovation, public health, and city and regional development from the bottom up? So we had all this bottom up stuff, but the issue of the constraints of national policy. So perhaps the panelists, we could all respond to that general question. I'll hand over now to Simon. Thank you.
Thanks very much, John. Thank you, everybody. That's some really very succinct sets of points in there. Very difficult to summarize complex relationships in a short amount of time we've got. What I'd like to do is capture that first sort of question first. And if we could go, this is going to be a surprise to our support, but I'd like to go to Emily Morrison first, because she asked a question that captures several sets of questions that have come up. We'll try and hear from Emily, actually verbally, but if not, I'll read her question out. Emily Morrison.
Thanks very much, Simon, and thank you so much to all the presentations today, which were really interesting. My question, I hope, ties a few of the themes together, which is just with so many intersection policy agendas that are affecting recovery on the one hand, such as we've heard about levelling up, the skills agenda, for example, but then urgent needs for local populations and local institutions who have been struggling to cope on the other. How do we balance strategies for recovery in a way that really takes into account local communities and stakeholder priorities and not just research, I suppose? And how do we also understand what works in order to make recovery a success? Thank you very much.
There are so many panelists. Des, do you want to have a go at that first? And we might hear from others. And then maybe Jane.
Yeah, I mean, I think, at one level, it's really important that we do listen carefully to communities. I think it's important to understand the stress that they've been under. So part of the issue, I think, has actually been to kind of map out the consequences of COVID on particular groups, communities, but also protected groups in society, etc. But I think there's also an issue about how do we support, these groups to get their voices heard and bring those voices into debate as effectively as we possibly can. I think there's a combination of things that universities can do. They can help to facilitate that process at a local level, but they can also bring in expertise, such as the work that Carnegie are doing, the work that Emily and her colleagues are doing at the Young Foundation. So there is a sense in which universities can both be a kind of facilitator in the local level, but also a source of expertise and knowledge that can be drawn in from elsewhere and can actually curate that knowledge exchange and knowledge transfer.
Jane.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. I think just building on Des's remarks, I think there is something about that convening and facilitating role which helps to bring together and give voice to local communities alongside public institutions, business, and academia. And I think the ability of bringing those different voices together is important. I think the other thing that we've sort of touched on is the importance of co-design. Actually understanding how we can come together, and Newcastle, Sarah referenced, did some work with Carnegie on the principles for those co-designs, which I think is a helpful reference point. I think finally I'd reflect on the role of universities as anchor institutions, as major employers and contributors to the supply chain. So the commitment and the way we behave in terms of our procurement strategies and our approach to things like real living wage is also an important part of the way in which we engage and play our role in local communities.
Thank you very much. We've got time for one more question from the audience, but I'm going to comment on how we're going to use all these questions because there's a super dialogue going. Peter O'Brien, if you're able to speak your question, otherwise I'll read it. Peter.
Thanks very much, Simon. Yeah, I just wondered, the press reporting today that the white paper on devolution in England is going to be shelved until next year. So, to what extent does having some form of devolved arrangement, mayoral combined authority, other resources and powers, provide that catalyst for successful civic university collaboration? So what are the transferable lessons from places that have devolution to those that don't? And how do we avoid, I guess, a two-tier kind of civic university system emerging? Thanks.
It's a really good question because there's such variability across our regions, particularly in terms of this complex set of governance structures. Beck Riley's an expert on this, so I'm going to invite her in. She might want to include Jonathan, given we've got a combined authority, but it's not as simple as it might sound, and it's certainly not as powerful as it would like to be. Beck.
Well, just picking up on Peter's comment, actually, I think one of the things that we do know is that places that don't have the capacity and capability to invest in good evidence-based and good strategy development fail to bring in funding and fail to win bids, and that might be one of the issues behind, you know, the whole devolution development. From a personal point of view, I think we need to put aside what relative devolution deals, actions, etc., that come down from government, and think about what the place needs. And it's about that collaboration and building that, regardless of what activity happens in that arena around us, and building those good links. And I think that, you know, universities want to create impact, and that is their foundation. Therefore, they should be willing to act with whatever organisations surround them. It's about creating that connectivity and putting in place, you know, big piece of what I do is around the skills and attributes of individuals that can enable that to happen. And I think that that's more important than any devolution deal.
Thanks very much. If Jonathan's happy, maybe John Goddard would like to comment on that. It's a really complex issue.
Yeah, just coming back to the sort of question I posed at the beginning, it's interesting that we have a devolution agenda. Okay, it's stalled coming out of one department of government. We have another department of government in the DFE, which is basically beginning to look at all the issues around skills and the announcements about FE. We have another department of government in BEIS, which is pursuing a levelling up agenda for R&D under the roadmap for R&D. I think what we do in the civic university movement have got to try and do is join all up those separate strands from the bottom upwards and make a message. And it's partly a political message, but we have to get out there and say, look, you in central government, if you really want to do this levelling up gender and pick up the left behind places, you need to also get your act together. And I think it's quite significant that the advisory group for the Civic University Commission, which has been set up by UPP, has got different parts of government together. So it's how we together both can work together at the bottom up, but also configure the discourse at the national level. Thank you.
John, thank you very much. We've got about a minute left, and I just want to express my huge thanks to the panelists. Again, a fantastically difficult thing to do in the time available. This is a complex issue, and I think they did brilliantly. And John, thank you for chairing that. And my sincere thanks to the first set of speakers. I know 2 have left, and it's just wonderful to hear from people who've had so much experience at the national level dealing with these things. We've got a very wide range of issues, but actually there are some key priorities that the chat line and the fantastic questions that have been coming in as we've been discussing, and we haven't had time to respond to them. But in a sense, the priority areas seem to be around the need to translate university research better. You know, Sarah Davidson made the point about reducing theory, but that's a simple thing to say. What it takes, and we hear this from the case studies, is a much deeper relationship with users, and in this case, policymakers. That means also not just dealing with research from universities, but connecting the skills agenda and the education and learning that universities do. And David Willits has long been a champion of these partnerships between HE and FE to create, you know, pathways to learning. I think that's critically important. It connects to the third issue we're picking up. There's a huge amount of chat and questions around bottom-up initiatives from citizens, inclusivity, particularly the needs for us to include low-income, low-skilled individuals who never connect with research-intensive universities, and that is a huge challenge. And it's made even greater by the current situation with COVID, but we must not leave that behind. And there's a strong set of both really interesting points about this, but also recommendations on action. And I think that's fantastic. What we're going to do is collect this. We're going to put it in the report that we're writing as an outcome from this. And there's a series of events and blogs and briefings that the Civic University Network is arranging, which will absolutely build on the questions, the chat, the presentations that you've heard today. And this report will be circulated to everyone who's registered for this event in time. But my final point, after again thanking everybody for their engagement, is to just urge you to keep engaged. And there's a whole range of social media routes that you can keep engaged with City Ready, the Civic University Network, but also the partners and their universities. The details are listed on the slide now. And in some ways, this is a long journey, and you know, we need to keep a focus on improving on all of these fronts. So many, many thanks for spending time with us today. We had a huge audience and a very, very, I think, constructive conversation. So thanks to everyone for joining in, and hopefully we'll see you at the next webinar. Many thanks. Going to sign off now.